Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would do this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video that I believe that I'm going to review by that of the boxing channel known as DontaesBoxingNation. Now, of course, I stated that I wasn't going to review, the LDBCs or certain boxing channels videos quite as often anymore, but I still am going to review it whenever I do find it necessary. And this was one of the videos that I found it to be, a little bit more necessary. But anyways, for those of you, of course, that do not know, the Canelo Alvarez versus Terence Bud Crawford fight, it is going to be upcoming, I believe, sometime in September. I believe September 13th. And I wanted to do this video a few days ago, but I just thought that this was very particularly interesting because both Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford, of course, they've been trading a little bit of barbs going back and forth, which, of course, you expect a little bit at a press conference. And certain people, of course, have been debating, always at a press conference, about who has gotten under the skin over the other a little bit more. Now, to be fair, I haven't really watched much of the press conferences, but I have seen a lot of the quotes. And what I will personally say is this. Although I do personally believe that Terence Bud Crawford believes that he can win this fight, I don't know if he thinks that he's going to with 100% certainty. And I believe that there was even a quote not too long ago where Crawford said something along the lines of, I'm 70% sure that I'm going to win this fight. Crawford, whatever he wants to stay, or state, excuse me, he does take a look at Canelo Alvarez as a different level, not only in terms of size, but also a different level of boxing royalty than whatever he's faced in his career. And that's why he wants to face Canelo Alvarez, but now there also is something in it for Canelo Alvarez. Canelo once again realizes that if he beats Terence Bud Crawford, he can convince a certain amount of the people that, basically this was his rematch against Floyd Mayweather Jr. And he can say, see, I can beat that black slick style, and many years ago when I fought Floyd Mayweather Jr., that really was not my peak form. You see me now at a better form, or at least when I'm more experienced and smarter and more complete as a fighter. And I do think overall, what I'll personally state is this, because you have extremists. You have, of course, the super racialized sides in Dante's Boxing Nation, overall, who, of course, we all know that he has a very racialized and very biased agenda. And, of course, he hates Canelo Alvarez's guts. So what is the narrative with Canelo Alvarez, at least with Dante, always going to be? That Canelo Alvarez is a hype job, that he's someone that every time he stepped up in competition, he lost. Every time Canelo Alvarez gets in the ring, overall with a great fighter, he ends up losing. Canelo has been cherry picking his whole career. It's not possible overall for all those things to happen when not only you have the resume of a Canelo Alvarez, but on top of that, when you're a four-weight division champion and you fought some of the biggest names in the sport. But anyways, we're going to talk about all that because, of course, you have your Canelo Alvarez fanboys, extremists as well, that go super far as well and want to state that, Canelo Alvarez was way too green and that he's a completely different fighter. And what I'll state is this. Although I do definitely think that he became a better fighter later on, I do also believe that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is also just a more complete fighter than that of a Canelo Alvarez. Now, that being stated, he's also a more complete fighter than Terence Bud Crawford. It just is what it is. But that being stated, one of the barbs that Canelo Alvarez apparently had stated about Terence Bud Crawford was criticizing his resume. And obviously Canelo Alvarez knows how to get to Terence Bud Crawford because that's the whole reason why Terence Bud Crawford took this fight. Crawford overall, you can tell that he definitely is sensitive about his resume because whether Terence Bud Crawford wants to admit it or not, he knows that his resume, at least compared to that of a Canelo, a Mayweather, a Pacquiao, his resume really ain't shit. And I'm sorry to state that. Don't get it twisted. Terence Bud Crawford is an all-time grade level fighter. He's someone that, of course, has a decently great resume. You cannot be an all-time grade level fighter without at least having somewhat of a resume. But Terence Bud Crawford, someone made the best comparison, I think probably about a month or two ago, where they stated that Terence Bud Crawford is almost like the Khabib Nurmagomedov, of boxing. Now, he's not as dominant or possibly all-around skilled for his sport as what a Khabib Nurmagomedov was for his sport, because not only was Khabib undefeated, but he was debatably the most dominant martial artist that I had ever seen in terms of just shutting his opponents down, even if they were A-grade level. But the point being is that Khabib Nurmagomedov, had he stuck around, he really could have debatably been in the GOAT conversation. He was so dominant and so skilled that many people actually include him in the GOAT conversation, although he only had 3 title defenses, I believe. one over Conor McGregor, one over Dustin Poirier, and one over that of Justin Gaethje. So, Terence Bud Crawford is very similar to that. And on top of that, of course, many people associate him with some of the great, all-time great black fighters of the past within America's history, which of course makes sense. But anyways, Canelo Alvarez, was talking about Crawford's resume, and basically what he stated is that you haven't really fought a whole lot of A-grade level names. And whether people want to admit it or not, that is the truth of the situation. When you talk about Canelo Alvarez, it's at least debatable that you can debate that Canelo Alvarez has fought around 11 and maybe 12 A-grade names. At least, 11 in my personal view. 10 to 11. When you talk about Crawford, there's really only about 5 A-grade level names in my personal view that he's ever fought in his career. Now, if you disagree with that, I would maybe understand, maybe with the exception of a couple of other fighters. But the point is that if we're going to, hold standards to certain people, we must be consistent with our standards. Because when it comes to Dante's Boxing Nation, what the standard always is, allegedly, is that Caucasian fighters or that Caucasoid fighters, that they're always the weakest in boxing because they haven't had as much of a dominant history as much as the black fighters or that as the Latino fighters. Which of course is the case, but the point being is that, are you going to just use that whenever you need to tear down someone's resume because you have an agenda against them? Because that's never the case with Terence Bud Crawford. Victor Postol, Ricky Burns, and Israel Madrimov, they're all Caucasoid fighters, and they're all counted as elite fighters in Dante's Boxing Nation's eyes. So how come only the Caucasian fighters that Usyk or Canelo Alvarez or Inoue fight, how come those are the only weak Caucasian fighters? Interesting. So, that's why I reviewed Dante's channel, because especially he attracts so many of the black boxing fans. A lot of them don't really understand that they're kind of being swindled. But I mean, it is what it is, or that this guy, that it's no offense, but, this is not a guy overall that is free from bias and especially racialized agendas. And I do think that it is important to talk about it because Dante, in my personal view, is not wrong with every point that he brings up, but he is a very, very biased commentator. But anyways, let's tune in. Let's see what he has to say.
What? Oh, shit. Hey, everybody know Team Crawford. Y'all know I get active. Let's go.
How good is Crawford?
Crawford is amazing, not just good. He's amazing. I think he should be in the book for
really? Is that good?
How to learn boxing,
Really?
He's a very good fighter.
Now, what I'll personally state is this, before this video goes any further. Terence Bud Crawford apparently most recently stated to Canelo Alvarez, which of course, I don't think that Terence Bud Crawford fully believes this, but Terence Bud Crawford also is trying to get under Canelo Alvarez's skin, where basically Canelo stated, "Who have you fought?" And Terence Bud Crawford overall has stated that every time you stepped up in competition, you lost, of course, talking to Canelo Alvarez. Now, of course, Canelo Alvarez officially in his career has only lost 2 official times. Of course, that one being the Floyd Mayweather Jr., which was a very dominant decision loss, where Floyd Mayweather Jr., now, we'll talk about that here in a minute. But of course, the other one, which also was a dominant decision loss over Dimitri Bivol. Now, of course, what the Terence Bud Crawford fan base has been debating for many years is that Terence Bud Crawford is an undefeated fighter and he was dominant against Errol Spence Jr. and yada, yada, yada. And all that is well and good. But my point is this. Has Errol Spence really ever been on the level of someone like a Floyd Mayweather Jr.? And has he really ever even been someone on the level of a Dimitri Bivol? And I know that certain people will say, what are you talking about? Errol Spence ended up defeating Danny Garcia and Sean Porter and all these other guys. And that's another thing. Danny Garcia, who recently retired, there are many of these channels like from Aki TV and some of these other guys that claim that Danny Garcia is not even a Hall of Famer. So why would Danny Garcia or Sean Porter, who pretty much have the same level of accomplishments, why would they be quote-unquote big names then if they're not even Hall of Famers? I mean, well, don't get it twisted. You don't always have to be a Hall of Famer, but the thing is that Danny Garcia and Sean Porter, you're talking about multiple-time champions right there. So, I mean, the point is that, we have to really decide, who's an A-grade level fighter and who's not and what our standards are, because a lot of people, a lot of boxing fans or a lot of channels or a lot of, publicists or media analysts, they basically kind of just go off of a narrative because they want it to be true because they're fanboys and they want it to be true overall for their favorite fighters. The truth of the matter is that when you take a look overall at Floyd Mayweather Jr., when Canelo lost to him, Canelo was a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, but it was very obvious that Floyd was still at the top of his game or very, very close to it. He still was looked at as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. It's not like Floyd was declining, or it's not like he had a major decline. There was no visible evidence that he was on the major decline. Now, was he 36 years old? Yes, he was 36 years old. But like I've always stated, everyone ages differently. Now, after the Canelo fight, I would state that Floyd Mayweather Jr. overall showed a visible decline. But not everyone at 36 years old shows a visible decline, especially if you were able to have the defensive mastery and overall the lack of punishment in your career that Floyd Mayweather Jr. had suffered. So not only was Floyd the #1 pound-for-pound fighter at the time, but let me just ask people this. Has Crawford ever fought anyone near close to the level of a Floyd Mayweather? Does anyone think that Errol Spence is as skilled or at the peak of his game was ever as all-around complete as Floyd Mayweather? Because I personally don't. It just is what it is. And then when we talk about the Dimitri Bivol situation, not only in my personal view can you debate that Dimitri Bivol is a more all-around skilled fighter than that of an Errol Spence Jr., but on top of that, Dimitri Bivol clearly was just bigger than Canelo Alvarez. You have this narrative going around that, Canelo Alvarez just lost to Dimitri Bivol because he was the better all-around fighter. Listen, don't get it twisted. Dimitri Bivol, of course, did overall, he did have a very dominant performance over Canelo. And I think that even if they were similar in height and reach and everything like that, overall that he still would give Canelo Alvarez a great handful. And we've seen great boxers in the past even more similar in size, like Araceli Lara and Gennady Golovkin, of course, give Canelo Alvarez a lot of problems. But let's not sit here and act like Canelo Alvarez is a natural light heavyweight. Now, Bivol is a little bit light in the ass for a light heavyweight, but he's been fighting there for his whole entire career. You're talking about a guy that is 6 foot, 6'1", somewhere around there, a guy that has beat Artur Beterbiev, Joe Smith Jr., John Pascal. Canelo Alvarez is a guy who's 5'7". And this is something that people need to understand because, once again, you have extremists from both sides. The point being is that the truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. Canelo Alvarez didn't just lose to Dimitri Bivol because of size, but he didn't just lose to him because Dimitri Bivol was just way more skilled than him. He partially lost to him also because Dimitri Bivol overall, he's just bigger. It just is what it is. He's been fighting light heavyweights his whole entire career. He was used to the, level of power of Canelo Alvarez, and he definitely was at least used to that size. Canelo was not a light heavyweight. Now you have guys like DontaesBoxingNation that will say that, oh, it's a quote-unquote size excuse. I don't see how it can really be a quote-unquote excuse or something that's not valid when Canelo Alvarez is 5 inches shorter than Dimitri Bivol? I mean, once again, people don't realize this. Canelo Alvarez is the only super middleweight champion in the history of boxing that has ever been 5'7" or 5'7.5". It's never happened before. I think the first official super middleweight champion was in 1984 or something. The majority of those guys are 6 foot to 6'2". So people don't understand that. I mean, the only great super middleweight that I know of that was a little bit undersized was James Toney, and he still was about 2 inches taller than Canelo Alvarez. Now, of course, certain people will say that it's not all about height, but height definitely is a definitive factor. Height overall and reach, especially with Canelo starting off at 154 when he was a champion, Canelo Alvarez is not a guy that is a natural light heavyweight. He's also not a guy that's a natural super middleweight. That's why whenever you see Canelo Alvarez against Caleb Plant or Danny Jacobs, even Gennady Golovkin or Callum Smith or, certain guys I'm trying to think of some of the other guys that he fought there. Rocky Fielding and, not saying every one of those guys that I mentioned is an A-grade fighter, Edgar Berlanga and Jaime Munguia, all those guys are clearly bigger than Canelo. It just is what it is. So you have these extremists like Dante, who, let's be real, they're part of their, pro-black cult. It is what it is. And they don't like seeing fighters like Canelo or Usyk, overall at the top because they have a racialized issue and they can't see the difference when someone actually, that is non-black deserves to be at the top versus when someone is being placed there because of propaganda, because of course they take a look at prior fighters like Roman Gonzalez or Gennady Golovkin or something like that, who had a little bit of realism to them, yes, but also a certain amount of propaganda, but the thing is about Canelo is that Canelo just has too much of a resume and too many accomplishments in his career to ever just be labeled as this quote-unquote hype job or this hype machine. It's just not possible, if you followed his career closely. And this is coming from someone that used to hate Canelo Alvarez's guts, but anyway.
Yeah, I like to watch his fights.
For me, pound for pound, #1 is Terence Crawford. I like...
Once again, keep in mind that Terence Bud Crawford, that he also recently stated that Alexander Usyk could be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. That's what he stated. And what did Dante's Boxing Nation say in response to that? He said nothing. Now, he'll use this point that all the Caucasian fighters or all the Caucasoid fighters or, all the other fighters of different demographics, that they'll call Crawford the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. But he won't ever mention that Crawford, that he stated that Usyk could be #1 pound-for-pound. And when all the black fighters were saying that Canelo was #1 pound-for-pound, such as Devin Haney, the Charlo brothers, and Gervonta Tank Davis, and some other ones, he was just saying that, oh, stop trying to appease the race fans. You're an Uncle Tom. So this dude, Dante's Boxing Nation, once again, he's not to be taken seriously, but I understand overall, once again, why he has a big following, because once again, the following that he's really overall garnered is pretty much the easiest to appeal to. The people overall that will always make excuses and blame everyone else for their problems. That's why Dante's Boxing Nation, when Deontay Wilder ended up getting defeated, the first thing that he made was excuses.
This man.
I think it's Crawford first.
I think Terence Crawford right now in the sport of boxing is the pound-for-pound best fighter in the sport of boxing right now.
So here we go again. Canelo Alvarez, they go back and forth where Canelo Alvarez, he starts trying to completely discredit Terence Crawford's resume. Now, first of all, this is funny because...
Well, it's very interesting because what does discredit really mean? Are you stating overall that he's trying to tear down his resume? But the point is this. Is it really discrediting if there's a little bit of truth to it? Because if you were to ask Dante's Boxing Nation and say something that Canelo Alvarez, that every time he stepped up in competition, he's lost, Dante wouldn't state that that's discrediting Canelo Alvarez. According to his agenda, that would just be telling the truth. Well, if we're taking a look at Terence Bud Crawford, no offense, but to state that he doesn't really have that much of a resume, it's not really discrediting Terence Bud Crawford. It's just the truth of the matter. I'm sorry, but you're not going to sit here and tell me, and I'm going to get one of these dumbass fanboys on here, talking about Terence Bud Crawford. Oh, you haven't watched his career. I've watched Terence Bud Crawford his whole entire career. He's from my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska, and I've been watching him ever since his championship fights. So please spare me with the bullshit. I've seen his whole run at 135. I've seen his whole run at 140. I've seen his whole run at 147, and the one fight he had at 154. So spare me with this horse shit. At the end of the day, we're going to talk about the resume because I'm sure Dante overall will go through some of the individual fighters. But anyways, let's tune in.
Errol Spence, he did the exact same thing. Canelo, he's repeating what Errol Spence said verbatim. Crawford, he hasn't beat anybody. He has a horrible resume, etc., etc., etc. Man, I'm going to completely debunk all of this and unpack it. But I want to first play the clip.
Don't get me wrong, okay? He's a good fighter, a great fighter. I always say before I see him calling me out and want to fight and everything, I say before he's a great fighter. But if you look at his career, mention one elite fighter.
Well, to state overall that he hasn't fought any elite fighters, in my personal view, wouldn't be correct. Now, it does depend on your quote-unquote definition of elite. When you talk about quote-unquote elite, that can mean an A-grade level fighter. That can mean someone that maybe is even a high B-grade level fighter. I mean, it depends on what your version of elite is. But the thing is that Crawford has at least fought one elite fighter. He did fight Errol Spence Jr. I'll at least give him that. If your definition of elite is clear A-grade level, not really any debate about it, or pound-for-pound level, he has at least fought one, pound-for-pound level fighter in Errol Spence Jr. Now, if we're talking about elite just in my terms, we're talking, A-grade level fighters. So we're talking about, Gamboa, Postal, maybe Madrimov, Spence, and Porter. Those are the ones that we're talking about. Now, of course, Crawford fans would state, well, what about Kell Brook and what about Amir Khan? Those guys were completely done. Now, what Dante will try to tell you about Canelo is that, he fought Danny Jacobs when he was old, or that he fought Cotto when he was old. He fought all these guys when they were old. Keep in mind that these guys were still champions and looked at a very good point in their career when Canelo Alvarez was able to beat them. When Crawford defeated Kell Brook and Errol Spence, they were on the downslide, and on top of that, Amir Khan, he had a tough decision, fight against Samuel Vargas. Go ahead and look it up. He had a tough decision fight against Samuel Vargas. Got knocked down once or twice in that fight, and then after that fight was when he fought Terence Bud Crawford. Amir Khan was not the same fighter once he got knocked out by Canelo. He just wasn't. It is what it is. And then when you take a look at Kell Brook, of course, he probably wasn't quite the same after Golovkin, but he definitely wasn't the same after Errol Spence. I mean, it just is what it is. Those guys were mincemeat. It's no offense.
Just mention me one elite fighter.
So Postal wasn't elite?
Who?
Victor Postal.
Who's that?
Canelo said, who's that?
The guy.
Oh, so he wasn't commercialized. He wasn't a great. Ricky Burns wasn't elite.
What? 40.
Ricky Burns was never an elite level fighter, Terrence. Just stop. And this is what I mean overall, that we really have to have quote unquote standards about who is an elite level fighter and who isn't. Because certain people, of course, will come on my channel and they say, well, this guy is a 3-weight or 4-weight division champion. You know, so I mean, he has to be an elite level fighter, right? But I mean, let's take a look at Adrian Broner, for example. Adrian Broner is someone that is a 4-weight division champion. I don't think that I would ever say that he was elite. I would say that he's a high B grade level fighter. But there's no offense, but some of these fighters out here are 3 or 4-weight division champions, and they ain't never beat anybody. So I mean, it is what it is. I mean, Ricky Burns' best win to this day is Roman Rocky Martinez. So, I mean, you know, if you count Roman Martinez as an A-grade level fighter, I mean, that's up to you. But I don't know if he was ever really an A-grade level fighter. And I mean, once again, what are the criticisms of Canelo, you know, when he fights these British Caucasian fighters? They don't have any power. You know, they're stiff. They're all this. Well, no offense. But it's like, what talent does Ricky Burns really have that would classify him as elite? Is he a one-shot knockout guy? No. Is he a guy that has the most amount of movement? No. Is he a guy overall that, you know, didn't have a loss before he fought Terence Crawford? No. And on top of that, he should have lost to Raimundo Beltran right before that fight anyway. So, I mean, it's like, you know, the point is that if you're going to make these points with Canelo, you have to make them with Crawford as well.
A 40 years old champion in that moment beat Mr. Poster in my gym. I saw that.
So Ricky Burns wasn't elite?
Ricky Burns has never been elite, Terrence. I'm sorry, but it is what it is.
Ricky Burns doesn't elite.
Okay.
He's not elite.
It's cool. Well,
is there a champion?
I'm going to fight another elite
There is
fighter
a champions,
in September.
good fighters, but elite fighters is different. Wait.
So I'm going to fight an elite fighter in September.
Yeah, okay.
Then we're
going to find out.
Then we're going to find out.
And don't get me wrong, you're a great fighter.
I know I'm great.
You're a great fighter, but you're going to find out. I hope your uncle Turki Alashi pay you enough money because it's going to be the last. That's for sure.
I tell you what, Canelo Alvarez is a little bit of an underrated trash talker. You know, Crawford, you know, he's a guy that, you know, does a little bit more improving inside the ring. He's a guy that he talks a little bit, but he doesn't really come across to me as a super witty or a super great trash talker. And that's not me stating that the man is dumb necessarily, but, you know, you have very intelligent people, but they just may not be, you know, quote unquote, quick a mouth or, you know, quick a tongue or something like that to where, you know, they're very witty with the comebacks. You know, Terence is an extraordinarily intelligent fighter. Now, as a person, I don't know if he's intelligent in many other areas. I wouldn't know. But, you know, same with Canelo. But the thing is that, you know, Canelo, he definitely knows how to get under the skin of some of his opponents.
Maybe. It may be. Maybe.
I hope he pay you enough.
But, you know, after fighters fight me, they never the same. So I just hope your career continue.
If you look at my career.
Right, Terence Crawford. But let's also admit, there were certain fighters that weren't quite the same when you fought them as well. Like Kell Brook and Amir Khan. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. Now, certain people overall would also state that Errol Spence, that he was in a car accident a couple times, and he was. But I'm not going to really state that that's the major excuse because, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, he did have that great performance over Yordenis Ugas, so I'm not going to, you know, completely go that far. Now, what I will state is this. If you're going to be a Dante's Boxing Nation and claim that Canelo Alvarez, that he fought Sergey the Crusher Kovalev after he was stopped twice, and that overall he fought, you know, some other fighters, that all this other stuff. Well, I mean, you know, like I had this one comment, I believe, one time where he stated that, oh, well, Canelo fought Danny Jacobs, who had cancer. And I mean, the cancer diagnosis was literally like seven years prior. And Danny Jacobs became a champion, you know, way after that diagnosis twice. So, I mean, that's not even relevant. But I mean, if you want to mention that, no problem. But then mention Errol Spence's car wrecks. I have no problem overall, even if I disagree with somebody, if your standards are at least consistent. But the problem is that way too many people overall, that their standards are just completely based off of their fanboys and their bitch assness. You know, so it is what it is. And I'm sorry, but I don't have that type of energy. I don't have time for that.
Never same after me.
Okay, so first things first, Canelo Alvarez, he's doing a wonderful job of completely repeating race fan talking points on the internet.
No, what he's doing overall is that he's getting under Terence Bud Crawford's skin. And there's no offense overall against Terence Crawford, but he knows that there's a little bit of a truth to that. That's why he didn't really have a rebuttal to that. It is what it is.
If you guys haven't noticed the pattern, whenever a black American boxer beats anyone, it doesn't matter how good he is, race fans will always try to discredit the win by saying the opponent, he wasn't that good, he didn't train for the fight, or he wasn't
Yes, and although that can happen very often, this is the thing with Dante's Boxing Nation. There's no offense against him. But Dante is another one of these simple ass dudes that he's almost like one of those guys that you see that claims racism with everything, and he just can't overall see the different shades of gray. Just because overall certain fans overall do that with other black fighters does not mean that it's the same situation in this situation. The point is that yes, you have certain people overall that will hype up a certain fighter and claim that, well, he was never that good in the first place, especially with black fighters. That definitely overall does happen. No doubt about it. But the thing is that, whoever really stated overall that, oh man, you better watch out for Ricky Burns, like you better watch out for Victor Postol. I mean, to be fair, there were some fans, a tiny margin, that were stating that Crawford was going to duck Postol, but I don't think anyone really ever seen Postol as a humongous threat. He had that one great win over Lucas Matisse. And let me also state this, because these same channels that claim that Danny Garcia is not a Hall of Famer, well, if Danny Garcia is not a Hall of Famer, how important is that Lucas Matisse win really? Because Matisse lost to Danny Garcia, and that was when Matisse was at his best. That was in his prime years. So I mean, how good is Postol really? If that's the best win of his career, and he lost every other big fight in his career. So I mean, once again, that's why I say we have to have a consistent standard of what is elite and what isn't.
Experience enough. He was too young, like Canelo when he fought Floyd Mayweather. Oscar, he was too old when he fought Floyd. Errol Spence, he was way too...
Right, well, here's the thing that I'll tell you, Dante. Because the excuse overall that you use with Canelo Alvarez and Golovkin all the time is that Golovkin was 36 years old, that Cotto was 35 years old. So then the point is this. Does that mean that when Mayweather defeated Sugar Shane Mosley right after he whooped Antonio Margarito's ass and became a welterweight champion again and was back on the pound-for-pound list, does that mean overall that Mayweather did not defeat an A-grade version of Shane Mosley? Does that mean that Shane Mosley was washed up? Does that mean overall that Oscar De La Hoya, who I'm guessing was around anywhere from 34 to 36 years old, if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me, when Floyd had fought him, does that mean that Oscar De La Hoya was not an A-grade level fighter at the time? The point is that way too many people, they don't know, overall how to put things, in a little bit more of the shades of gray. They'll just state overall that a fighter is either completely washed up or not in their prime anymore. And basically they'll state that either they were at a great point or a bad point. Sometimes you have a fighter that's still at a very good point or a relatively great point, but they're not at their absolute peak anymore. I mean, once again, every fighter is different and you have to take a look at their career individually.
Drain when he fought Terence Crawford, etc., etc., etc. We know what time it is. Meanwhile, Tyson Fury, he beats Wilder, full credit. Canelo Alvarez, he beats Caleb Smith, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, full credit. George Kambosos beats T.O.
But Canelo Alvarez didn't get full credit from you, Dante. You always claimed overall that Saunders, that he was a C-grade level fighter. In fact, you stated that every one of the Caucasian fighters or every one of the Caucasoid fighters that Canelo Alvarez had fought there, or the European champions, that they were bums, that they were C-grade level fighters. That's what you said. And then apparently David Benavidez and Caleb Plant, apparently that's one of the biggest fights in boxing. How can David Benavidez, the guy that's allegedly going to destroy Canelo Alvarez, how can that be one of the biggest fights in boxing if Caleb Plant's a C-grade level fighter? It doesn't make any sense. And that's why I've already stated. Dante doesn't even believe the shit that he's stating. But he's such a hater that he doesn't even realize his own stupidity. Anyway.
Teofimo Lopez. Teofimo turns down a rematch. Devin Haney beats George Kambosos. Now George Kambosos is trash. But then Lomachenko beats George Kambosos, and it's a terrific win. Go back and watch the fight on ESPN.
Dante's Boxing Nation, you understand that George Kambosos was not a guy that was going to hold on to those belts for long. And that's why you were even pissed off that Lomachenko was allegedly going to get that Kambosos fight before Devin Haney, because you knew that would mean that Lomachenko then would become completely undisputed. You even said that. So let's stop playing this bullshit. Don't get it twisted. George Kambosos, in my view, was probably about an A- level fighter. But he wasn't ever someone that was going to stay at those belts for long. He was a bad style matchup for Teofimo Lopez. He wasn't going to beat anyone else elite who was actually going to take him seriously. Teofimo Lopez, I think, underestimated him heavily. And on top of that, they both had very similar styles. And Teo has certain holes in this game. That's pretty much what ended up happening. And that's why when certain people overall state that, oh, well, this fighter, overall ended up winning the belt, right? But just because certain fighters actually win a belt doesn't always mean that they're elite. And there are certain fighters that end up winning a match, and they're not really supposed to win that match in the first place. But because either A, they just have the best nights, like a Buster Douglas versus Mike Tyson, or a Leon Spinks versus Muhammad Ali, or something like that. They end up either, I'm not going to say getting lucky, but they end up having the perfect night or catching them on an off night or when they underestimate them. George Kambosos was an A- level fighter, but that's pretty much what he is. He's not really anything greater. So, I mean, it just is what it is.
Look at the way they praise
Same with Jeff Horn versus Manny Pacquiao.
Lomachenko when he beat George Kambosos. Joe Tessitore, he's the same person who said that George Kambosos was never a good fighter right after Devin Haney had beat him. But he was the one that was praising the hell out of Lomachenko when he beat Kambosos. He was also one of the main...
Right, and we know that Joe Tessitore, definitely is a Lomachenko fan. So, I mean, he's not overall, once again, the most, reliable source to go to. But anyway.
Ones pushing the propaganda saying that George Kambosos was undisputed when he was about to fight against Teofimo Lopez. When the truth was Kambosos only had 3 belts and Devin Haney had the WBC belt. Okay, so now let's go ahead and unpack everything Canelo Alvarez said to Terence Crawford when it comes to his resume. See, here's the problem when it comes to a lot of Black American fighters. They're dominant in the ring, but outside of the ring, man, they don't know how to debate. They don't know how to bring up all the actual irrefutable facts. They're just complete.
Well, what are the irrefutable facts about Terence Bud Crawford's resume, DontaesBoxingNation, compared to Canelo Alvarez? Because Canelo Alvarez's standards are always way higher, at least to your standards, of what Terence Bud Crawford's are. So let's hear him.
Completely lost when someone tries to discredit their resume. I mean, Terence Crawford, he could have made Canelo Alvarez look so bad when it comes to his resume. You see, there's a lot.
No, he really couldn't have. And that's the reason why Terence Bud Crawford really didn't have anything to say. The best thing that he really can say is that every time overall you stepped up in class, you ended up losing, hoping that that's going to get under Canelo Alvarez's skin. And I have no idea whether it did or not. But between the two fighters, there's no offense, but I think it's a little bit easier, actually probably way easier, to get under the skin of a Terence Bud Crawford. You can just tell that he's insecure about his resume. And I get it. Because Terence Bud Crawford overall is a guy that not only grew up in a household and his whole life being kind of underestimated or, not having people have faith in him. I get it. But on top of that, he knows that his resume is not comparable to Floyd's. It just is what it is. Like, it would be different if this was Floyd Mayweather Jr. sitting across from him and Floyd fought Cotto and Mosley and Marquez and De La Hoya when they were all champions or at least at A-grade points in their career. But this isn't Floyd. It is what it is.
A lot of deception taking place, especially when it comes to...
No, there's no deception taking place at all. It's just that the Terence Bud Crawford fanboys, that they keep trying to overall push certain fighters on Crawford's resume that are alleged A-grade level fighters that aren't A-grade level fighters.
Canelo Alvarez.
Now just ask yourself, if Inoue had been fighting guys like Julius Ndongo, who was from Africa, from a country that most people don't even fucking know, would people be stating overall that Inoue beat an elite level champion? If Inoue beat someone like a Victor Postol, would people really be stating overall that he's an A-grade level champion? Or would they be stating overall that he beat a guy that really wasn't that well known? Because Inoue has defeated a multitude of, European champions. Like, I remember when he defeated that one dude, I believe Jamie McDonald or something like that, and a couple of others. Like, he defeated Emmanuel Rodriguez, who was undefeated, who defeated one of the Gary Russell brothers. So, I mean, the point is that, once again, what are the standards of a quote-unquote elite level fighter?
Resume. See, a lot of you fans and Canelo Alvarez as well, because once again, he follows the narrative of whatever race fans are saying on the internet. So a lot of
Well, I think that Canelo Alvarez realizes what gets under Terence Bud Crawford's skin.
fans believe having a good resume includes the guys that you lost to. That's where you're wrong. It doesn't include the guys that you lost to. You don't get credit for who you lose to. Anybody can...
Sure, but at the end of the day, when we even don't include the two guys that Canelo Alvarez has lost to, let's take a look at all the fighters that could be possibly considered anywhere from A- to A+. You're talking about, once again, his run at 154, Austin Trout, when he beat Miguel Cotto. I would claim overall that he was A- at the time. Now, of course, after the Canelo and Lara fights, he wasn't really ever quite the same form ever again. He kind of was on a major decline after that. But that was looked at as a major 50-50 level fight at the time. After that, of course, he ended up fighting that of an Arasani Lara, which, of course, a lot of people thought was a controversial fight. But at the time, it was a fight that was looked at as 50-50. And Lara, of course, comes from the very good Cuban boxing school. And I believe that he also was a great Olympian and amateur boxer as well. So we got to include that one. And he did end up winning that fight, whether you thought that he won it or not. But at the end of the day, the truth of the matter is that that fight was a close enough fight to where it could have went either way. And they gave it to Canelo. It just is what it is. And then, of course, after that, he ended up fighting, I believe, that of Miguel Cotto, when Cotto was a champion at the middleweight division. A bit older and, of course, clearly smaller than Canelo, but still someone that obviously, of course, was at a decent point. Now, of course, certain people will try to compare, Cotto or Golovkin and say, well, he fought them when they were older, so how come Crawford overall doesn't get credit over Kell Brook or Amir Khan? Because those guys were no longer anywhere near championship level material. Certain people overall ask me what a quote-unquote washed-up fighter is. What a washed-up fighter is a fighter that is no longer able to win a belt in any particular weight class. No particular weight class. There was no way that Kell Brook was ever going to win a title ever again at that point in time in his career. There was no way that Amir Khan was ever going to win a title again at that point in time in his career. And even when they were in recent fights against B or C grade level fighters that either, were notable C grade level fighters or that people had never heard of, like the people that Kell Brook were fighting, people had noted the downslide and slowing down and damage that they obviously had suffered. So, spare me this bullshit. But anyway, Cotto overall was the ring and WBC middleweight champion at the time. And on top of that, Golovkin was almost completely unified. So comparing it wouldn't even make sense.
They can lose. It's easy to lose. What's harder to do is to win. I don't care how big the names are. You lost.
And of course, when you talk about afterwards overall, once again, he ended up beating Gennady Golovkin, who had pound-for-pound acclaim. Later on, of course, after that, he ended up defeating Danny Jacobs, who was a champion at the time. All right. Later on, of course, he ended up defeating, I believe, who was the next guy defeated after that? I believe Billy Joe Saunders or Callum Smith, one of the two. Now, of course, people take a look at Callum Smith and say that, oh, he's just a quote-unquote European bum. Let me ask you something. Who's more elite between Callum Smith overall and and Ricky Burns? It sure as hell ain't Ricky Burns, because Ricky Burns does not have the all-around talent that Callum Smith has. Callum Smith is someone that has a decent amount more punching power, more athleticism, probably better all-around boxing ability. It's no offense, but that win that Callum Smith ended up getting against Joshua Buatsi, that one decently talented fighter in his last fight, and dominated him, that's probably a better all-around talent than what Ricky Burns has ever defeated in his career. And people ain't gonna like that, but it is what it is. Keep in mind that right before the Crawford fight, Ricky Burns got his ass whooped against Raimundo Beltran, got his jaw broken, and they ended up giving him a robbery draw. But anyway.
Lost to that person. You get no credit for that. Do you know how many losers?
And of course, that's not even me including, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, overall, who else? Jermell Charlo, and possibly Jaime Munguia as well.
Have fought some of the biggest names in the sport of boxing. So Terence Crawford, he really could have flipped this on Canelo Alvarez and exposed Canelo Alvarez's resume. All Terence Crawford had to say is, name the elite boxers that you beat. Because when you ask a question like that, that's when the list gets really, really short. Because there is...
No, it really doesn't get that short at all. When you talk about, once again, Canelo Alvarez, it's no offense against Crawford, but Canelo has defeated more dangerous fighters than Crawford has. And it's just really not that close. I'm sorry. Now, when you want to talk about pound-for-pound acclaim fighters, of course, the two fighters that he fought that had pound-for-pound acclaim, at least top 10 pound-for-pound. You could claim overall that he's 1-1-1, because, of course, he had a draw against Golovkin, then, of course, he beat Golovkin, and, of course, he lost to Mayweather. Now, of course, people, of course, will point out Bivol, but beating Canelo Alvarez in the first place is actually what put Bivol on the list. He wasn't top 10 pound-for-pound yet. So, it is what it is. But once again, we do have to put a little bit, overall of fair context in that. Because Canelo Alvarez, once again, he's not a light heavyweight. You have these people overall that claim that he's a light heavyweight. You cannot be a light heavyweight and be a guy that is not even as big as a lot of the super middleweights at 5'7.5". It's not possible. Name me one light heavyweight champion that you've seen within the past 30 or 40 years that was 5'7.5". It's not going to happen.
There's no way you can say Canelo Alvarez has beat better competition.
And I mean, expected not only to be a champion there, but beat literally one of the best fighters in the world there, the best light heavyweight champion in the world. Not going to happen. Not when the other guy is great athletically, great skill-wise, bigger, and 6 foot. Not going to happen.
Than Terence Crawford. We all know the best fighter that Canelo Alvarez has beat was Gennady Golovkin. And the first 2 fights ended in controversy, where a lot of people don't...
Well, Dante's Boxing Nation, 10 years ago, or however long ago that fight was, because Gennady Golovkin was the main threat, and you didn't think that Canelo would ever become this big of a threat, you were stating overall that Canelo Alvarez, that he made it close enough to where he could have won. But now, overall, you know that Canelo Alvarez is more of a threat to the all-time great conversation. You want to claim overall that Golovkin apparently got robbed in those fights. So this is why, once again, I have no respect for this guy's commentary, because this dude is just a snake that will make whatever argument overall that he can in order to prove his argument. Like, get the fuck out of here.
Don't even believe that he won those fights. So
right, but once again, do we go off of quote-unquote believe, or do we go off of results? Do we say that Sugar Ray Leonard is not an all-time great level fighter because a lot of people don't believe that he won the second Tommy Hearns match? And also a lot of people don't believe that he ended up winning the Marvin Hagler match. So are we going to just hold that against Sugar Ray Leonard forever? Or are we going to go with the results? Now, don't get it twisted. There's a difference between a fight that could have went either way, or maybe somewhat controversial, and a complete robbery. Like when you talk about Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker and Chavez Sr., that's a different situation. Or Araceli Lara versus Paul Williams, that's a different situation. But when you talk about a fight that could have went either way, no, we can't just hold that over the fighter's head forever and say, well, a lot of people thought that you really lost that fight. I mean, we can compare it to Terence Crawford and state that Crawford was more dominant in some of his bigger fights if you want to do that. But I mean, the thing is that we can't just overall put that over certain heads of certain fighters because we want to have an agenda afoot, or that we want to make that argument and then not hold the same standards. We can't do that shit. So come on.
Name 2 or 3 elite fighters that Canelo Alvarez beat, dominated with no controversy.
Right, but that once again is a loaded question, Dante. That's not the question. What the original question was that who has Canelo Alvarez beat overall that was quote unquote elite? It's not overall about quote unquote dominance or without controversy. Because I mean, the thing is that, overall Gennady Golovkin at one point in time was having debates as the #1 pound for pound fighter. Crawford has never defeated a fighter like that. It is what it is. Now, I mean, Spence to a degree, but I mean, Spence and Golovkin, I mean, they probably have similar accomplishments, but Golovkin probably would be looked at as the greater fighter, overall at the end of the day, especially with his accomplishments. Now, some would debate that, and I get it, because Gennady doesn't have the most powerful of resumes, but I mean, it just is what it is. But anyway.
That would mean you can't...
And once again, do we hold these standards overall to a lot of other fighters? Do we claim overall that Muhammad Ali is not as great of a heavyweight as some of the other guys because overall in the first fight against Joe Frazier, he ended up losing? He didn't win all 3 fights. Do we claim that? Do we claim that because Muhammad Ali ended up losing to Leon Spinks that he's not debatably the greatest heavyweight of all time, and that a lot of people thought that he lost to Ken Norton? Does that immediately disqualify him as the greatest heavyweight of all time? Does that mean that we need to immediately put Lennox Lewis over him? Is that what that means? I mean, if that's your debate, no problem. But at least be consistent.
Cannot include Gennady Golovkin. You cannot include Araceli Lara. You can't include Shane Mosley because Shane Mosley wasn't even ranked when Canelo...
Well, there's a reason why I did not include Sugar Shane Mosley within that, because Sugar Shane Mosley was pretty much done at the time. Sugar Shane Mosley overall was on a losing streak, and on top of that, he was like 40 years old at the time. So when he fought Sugar Shane Mosley, he was old. Now, the thing is that what people will try to do, the Canelo people overall, when they try to, dismantle his record, they try to put Cotto or they try to put Golovkin in the same sentence as Mosley. It's not even a comparison. When Mosley had fought Canelo Alvarez, he had lost 2 fights in a row. He was no longer a champion, and he very clearly was not at a peak form or at a prime form anymore. Very obvious. But when he fought Cotto, Cotto was at a very good level. And when he fought Golovkin, he pretty much was at his peak form. So once again, most people really overall don't know what the hell they're talking about. But anyway.
Canelo fought him. What you guys have to understand is in every other sport, you have to go to the playoffs and then you go to the championship. You fight against people who earned their spot, right? When you go to the Olympics, you fighting against a guy who made it to the semifinals, the quarterfinals. So that means you're playing against a team who is currently the best at that time, or you're fighting against an opponent who is currently the best at that time, who made it all the way to the finals. So just to give you guys a...
Right, but Dante's Boxing Nation, you're kind of arguing against your own point. Because the thing is about boxing is that you can kind of pick your opponents, at least to a certain degree. Or you may fight opponents that may not be the necessarily best guy of that particular year. It's a little bit more of a variance. So, I mean, the thing is that you can fight a fighter that was looked at as formerly great, but he may not be great anymore. So, I mean, that's kind of the problem. And, I mean, I'm sorry, but if that argument were more applicable to either of the two, it would have to be more applicable to Terence Bud Crawford. I'm sorry.
As a better example, when Shane Mosley fought Canelo Alvarez, Shane Mosley, he didn't make it to the playoffs. He wasn't even ranked. In fact, Shane Mosley, he was coming off of 2 losses and a draw when he fought against Canelo Alvarez. So Canelo gets no credit for that win. See, these fans, they keep...
Well, he gets credit, but he just doesn't get A-grade level credit, in my personal view. So I do agree with that.
Trying to use name salad.
But here's the thing, Dante. You have to keep those same standards with Amir Khan and Kell Brook, because those guys were not overall elite when Terence Bud Crawford fought them. They were not.
But distract you and blind you with the names. Look at the names on Canelo Alvarez's resume.
And so far, Dante's Boxing Nation really hasn't done anything to debunk Canelo Alvarez's resume. Even Dante's Boxing Nation knows that Canelo Alvarez's resume is greater than Crawford's. You know how I know that? Because instead of Dante's Boxing Nation just getting straight to the point, he always has to give this fucking caveat. He always has to do this. Well, who is Canelo Alvarez beat without controversy? The reason why he's saying without controversy is because he knows that Canelo has better names on there. So, I mean, come on. Like, the argument isn't about, if you want to talk about that, that's a separate conversation. But if you want to talk about overall elite fighters, who's beat more elite fighters, yes, it's Canelo. And it's not comparable.
Those names mean absolutely nothing if you didn't beat them.
And if we also want to talk about another pound-for-pound fighter, to be honest with you, although, the LDBC has abandoned this motherfucker overall like an unborn stepchild. Or excuse me, like a redhead stepchild. Jamel Charlo, you don't even hear about that motherfucker anymore from these channels. Ever since overall he ended up laying down against Canelo Alvarez. Remember all that talk that Dante was saying that Jamel Charlo might even have an easier time over Canelo than what he did against Brian Castano? Remember all that shit? And these guys, Dante, I don't ever hear him claim overall when Marquez ended up moving 2 weight classes against Floyd, and they were more comparable in size because Floyd started off his career at 130 or 135. I don't ever hear any complaints about that. But when it comes to Canelo Alvarez fighting 6-foot Charlo, a guy overall that really should be more middleweight, and Canelo should be more middleweight, it's a complete size excuse. And remember, Jamel Charlo was allegedly, in their view, top 5 pound per pound. But they don't count that one. Interesting.
Or they're coming off of a loss, or a couple of losses in Shane Mosley's case. Now, since Terence Crawford...
Right, but who else has Canelo Alvarez fought overall that was coming off of multiple losses right before he fought them, or weren't at an A-grade level in their career?
Brought up Victor Postal. Victor Postal was a playoff type of opponent. So a lot of these fans...
Right, he was a playoff type of opponent, but he was a first-round playoff type of opponent, a second-round playoff type of opponent at most. If we're going to be talking about, quote-unquote playoff contention type of mode, when we talk about, Canelo Alvarez, against Austin Trout was a guy that, probably would have been a second-rounder. When we talk about Lara, that's a guy that either is a semifinalist or is a guy overall that can make it to the championship. When you talk about Cotto was a guy overall that could have made it overall debatably to the semifinals. I'm not going to claim that he could have made it to the absolute finals at that time because he was a bit older, but he still was a guy that was very, very good at the time. He still was A grade, at least A- at the time. Then after that, when you talk about Gennady Golovkin, that's a guy that obviously, could have went to the championship. When you talk about after that, Danny Jacobs, that's a guy that could have at least made it to the semifinals. When you talk about that of a Caleb Plant, that's a guy that could have made it debatably to the semifinals. When you talk about overall that of a Callum Smith, that's a second rounder. In my personal view, when you talk about Billy Joe Saunders, that's a second rounder, in my personal view. And when you talk about some of the other guys, overall, they also debatably could be second rounders or go to the finals. When you talk about Kovalev, he would have been a second rounder at the time. Now, of course, what people like to say is that Kovalev was washed up. He was not washed up. Now, was he the same crusher that he was? No. But the thing is that's why I compare that fight to Floyd fighting Oscar. Oscar wasn't the same peak form, but he still overall was a great champion at the time. He still was a champion and an A- or A-level fighter at the time. It was the same with Kovalev. Kovalev had just, got a dominant performance in revenge over later Alvarez. Then he knocked out the very talented, what was his name? Anthony Yard. The undefeated British fighter who was very athletic. The same fighter that Dante always used to give a whole bunch of praise to and said that he thought possibly could have defeated Artur Beterbiev or gave a tough time to. He was the first one to ever defeat Anthony Yard. And that's when Canelo Alvarez fought Kovalev. So once again, Dante, all this other bullshit, he doesn't really believe in some of the stuff that he's saying, but he's such a hater once again that, it kind of blinds him. But anyway.
They either didn't follow Terence Crawford's entire career or they just have convenient memory. Not only was Terence Crawford being accused of ducking Victor Postal at the time, but this is also the time
he was being accused of ducking Victor Postal overall by a certain amount of people, but by a very small fan base. And how soon Dante's Boxing Nation forgets that both him and Aki TV were claiming that Canelo Alvarez was going to avoid both Billy Joe Saunders and that of Caleb Plant. And when he finally fought them, they basically claimed overall that, they're bums anyway. So once again, these guys have, such haterade, but I mean, it is what it is.
Time when a lot of fans were saying that the Eastern European fighters, they have taken over the sport. They're dominating the sport right now. Victor Postal was one of those Eastern European fighters.
Victor Postal was an Eastern European fighter, but let's not sit here and act like he was on the same level as Gennady Golovkin and some of these other guys. Let's just stop it. That's like me overall talking about the elite level of black fighters, and then I want to talk about overall and say, Richardson Hitchens, overall is a guy that, he's one of those elite level black fighters. Like, no, stop. Victor Postal was a very good Eastern European fighter. He was not on the same level as any of those other guys that we're talking about. Never, ever was Victor Postal ever looked at as a Sergey Kovalev or a Gennady Golovkin or a Alexander Usyk or Vasily Lomachenko or any one of those guys. That would be like comparing Karen Chukachan or whatever the fuck that one Ukrainian fighter's name is that fought Jaron Butsenis and saying that, let's compare him to Artur Beterbiev or Dmitry Bivol. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Come on.
He was 28-0, and he had knocked out Lucas Matisse. Lucas Matisse was a beast at the time. He was
a very good fighter, but he wasn't really anything above an A- level fighter. There's no offense against Lucas Matisse. He had his time in the sun, but there's a reason why he lost to Danny Garcia.
Like a Murder Zaliev. He had never been knocked out before. He was a very aggressive Argentine.
Right, but he had lost before. He had lost to Danny Garcia.
Knockout.
And that wasn't even the only time that he had ever lost. Now, if that was in a way, or someone like that overall that was beating that of a Lucas Matisse, someone that had already lost to Zab Judah when he was older, overall, though certain people would debate that decision, and then also ended up losing to that of a Danny Garcia, they would claim that Matisse would be a bum. So, I mean, once again, what are the standards of a quote-unquote elite level fighter? Now, Matisse, in my view, was an A-grade level fighter. It was a good win. But it's no offense against Postal, but he also very clearly outsized Matisse. He was, about 5 or, to 6 inches taller than Matisse. And on top of that, he was a guy that, was really using his length and his size throughout that whole entire match. So, I mean, it is what it is. He got that one great win in his career. And then every other time he stepped up in class, he ended up losing. That's pretty much the story of Victor Postal.
Knockout artist who had technique on top of his aggression. Now, by way of contrast, when you look at some of Canelo Alvarez's recent opponents, from Caleb Smith to Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, John Ryder, Berlanga, William Scoll, none of those fighters have a win as big as Victor Postal's win over Lucas Matisse. Even when it comes to...
Right, but does that make them greater than a certain opponent, Dante's Boxing Nation? Leon Spinks ended up defeating Muhammad Ali. There's a bunch of fighters overall that never defeated Muhammad Ali. Does that mean that Leon Spinks is better than some of those other fighters? George Foreman never ended up defeating Muhammad Ali, but Leon Spinks ended up defeating Muhammad Ali. Does that mean that Leon Spinks is better than George Foreman? Just because, once again, a fighter ends up defeating a certain fighter because of a stylistic matchup doesn't mean overall that that other fighter is better than the other one. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. You're not going to sit here and tell me that Victor Postol is all around more skilled or better than Billy Joe Saunders. No. Sorry, but it is what it is. You're not going to sit here and tell me that he's better than Caleb Plant. No. You're not going to sit here and tell me that he's better than Callum Smith. No, he's not. Once again, Victor Postol got one good win in his career, and then the rest of his career he ended up losing to every other big fighter he ever fought. Period.
Comes to Terence Crawford beating Jeff Horn. None of those opponents that I just named that Canelo Alvarez faced had a better win or a win as big as Jeff Horn had beating Manny Pacquiao. And Jeff Horn was such a...
Right, but once again, just because someone has a win over a great fighter, does that really mean overall that they're greater than that quote-unquote said fighter? You know, once again, styles make fights. Ricardo Mayorga ended up defeating Vernon Forrest at the end of the day. You know, Shane Mosley never defeated, Vernon Forrest, but then take a look at the fight. You know, Shane Mosley ended up defeating Ricardo Mayorga, I believe, on one occasion when they were both more, kind of at their peak forms. So once again, we can't always go off of that. You know, sometimes a great fighter will have an off night, or once again, there are certain fighters that end up winning a belt that don't really deserve to win the belt. Now, I'm not going to go as far to state that Victor Postol, that he didn't deserve to win the belt because he fought the fight very good. But at the end of the day, the point is this. Sometimes there are just perfect stylistic matchups. And Matisse, although he was a guy that was very, very good, he was a guy that a lot of the times, if he couldn't pressure you to a certain degree or get his offense off, he was a little bit more limited. And that was exposed against Danny Garcia. So, I mean, it is what it is. But anyways, not only that, but on top of that, Postol clearly had the size advantage. So, I mean, it was really a perfect stylistic matchup. But anytime Victor Postol fought another A-grade level fighter, debatably that was near his own same size, he lost.
Such a difficult fight for Manny Pacquiao. Do you guys know that Manny Pacquiao, he turned down the rematch? Pacquiao, he turned down the rematch for the same reason Canelo Alvarez turned down an immediate rematch against Bivol. Because if he were to lose to...
Right, but when people mention Jeff Horn, let me also state this once again. How many of you would have said that Jeff Horn is going to beat Keith Thurman, or a prime Kell Brook, or a prime Errol Spence, or a prime Danny Garcia, or a prime Sean Porter, or a prime Yordenis Ugas? You don't think that he's going to defeat any of those fighters. Now, Manny Pacquiao a few years later would defeat Keith Thurman. So does that mean that Jeff Horn is better than Keith Thurman? That's why I say, once again, there are certain fighters that end up winning because it's either just their night overall, or because, the fighter may have underestimated them, or yada, 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 or a certain amount of other things. We've seen this story before. Ricardo Mayorga ended up defeating Vernon Forrest, but he ended up, there are certain fighters that end up basically making their career because of one win. Buster Douglas was one of those fighters. He actually had exceptional talent, but he could never get himself in the gym and ever take care of himself. And that's why he ended up losing to a lot of the top contenders. And of course, ended up losing to that of an Evander Holyfield, but he beat Mike Tyson. When you take a look overall once again at Ricardo Mayorga, he was really only known because of his win over Vernon Forrest, but then when it came to any other big fights in his career, he pretty much got his ass whooped. I mean, it is what it is. When you take a look at Leon Spinks, he got that one great win over Muhammad Ali, I think maybe one other decent win, and then take a look at his all-around career. Man's like, 17-15 or something like that. There's a multitude of fighters that have just had that. They end up overall having their little Cinderella story, and then when that actually comes to be consistent, when a fighter takes them seriously, they can't do it. So, I mean, it just is what it is. But give me a break on this. Will Postol and Jeff Horn have a bigger win? That's great, but that's only, usable to a degree. Because there's a multitude of examples, once again, to where that just doesn't really hold up.
To Bivol 2 times in a row, that would have really ruined Canelo Alvarez's career and reputation.
Well, of course it would have, which is why I don't blame Canelo Alvarez for not rematching Dimitri Bivol, especially because he doesn't belong at that weight class.
The reason why Canelo Alvarez, he started taking on soft touches and easier opponents after he lost to Bivol. He realized that he wasn't on that.
Well, interesting. DontaesBoxingNation basically just told on himself, wait a minute, Dante, I thought the touches that Canelo Alvarez was fighting before that of Dimitri Bivol were soft touches. Because all the fighters that he fought before Dimitri Bivol, who were they? Callum Smith, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders. I thought that those guys were C-grade level fighters, Dante. How come overall all of a sudden you're kind of saying that the rest were soft touches? Once again, Dante doesn't truly believe a lot of the shit that he's saying, or he knows subconsciously overall that once again a lot of the stuff that he's saying is bullshit. But it is what it is. Anyway.
That level to fight against dangerous, tough opponents, unless it was an opponent that was 2 or 3 weight classes smaller than him, like a Terence Crawford. Man, Crawford, if he knew what he was doing, he could have destroyed and embarrassed the hell out of Canelo when he brought up this whole elite opponent point. I'm just going to give you guys one more example, because I can give you tons of examples when it comes to fighters that Terence Crawford beat. But let's talk about Ndongo. Ndongo is another fighter. He knocked out the undefeated Russian knockout artist, Eduard Troyanovsky.
Troyanovsky was not an elite level fighter. Dante's Boxing Nation always does this shit overall to where he tries to hype up overall all these certain fighters. Troyanovsky was not an elite level fighter. He was undefeated and fought a whole bunch of bums. If you take a look overall at his record, the man didn't fight anybody. It is what it is.
Ndongo knocked him out to become champion. And before Troyanovsky lost to Ndongo, Troyanovsky, he fought a really good undefeated Argentine fighter by the name of...
Argentine fighter that was like 48 or 49-0. I remember because he was allegedly about to surpass Marciano and, what was his name? Floyd Mayweather's record. And people were overall hyping it up at the time. Then the first fight that he ever fought that had any meaning against Troyanovsky, man gets beat twice. So all this bullshit, you know, good Argentine fighter. Take a look overall, for those of you that don't know, because I do my research and I remember this. Take a look at that Argentine fighter's, resume. He was like 47-0 at the time or something like that. First time he ever had a fight with any goddamn meaning. You know, he fought Edward Troyanovsky and he ended up losing twice. You know, get the fuck out of here with that. He fought an Argentine fighter that was undefeated because he fought a whole bunch of bums. And that's why I believe that Argentine fighter was never a champion. How the fuck are you 46-0 and you've never even won one of the official belts? Get the hell out of here.
Of Cesar Rene Cuenca. He was 48-0, and Cuenca had beat some good opponents. So, man,
really, like who?
And if I really dissected this whole situation, this would be a damn near 1-hour video. But with that being said, man, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
So apparently that was Dante's version of quote-unquote breaking it down. Once again, even Dante's Boxing Nation knows that he's full of shit. But anyways, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because I'm also responding to what Terence Crawford stated as well. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Comment overall below what y'all think. And that's about it. Peace.